The courtroom was unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning. The ceiling fans whirred with mechanical rhythm, rustling case files that lay stacked high on the long oak tables. The air was thick, not with heat, but with tension. Something about today felt heavier than usual, and everyone seemed to sense it. In the far corner of the room sat Lila, just 3 years old. Small and slight, her legs barely reached the edge of the seat. She wore a pale yellow dress with lace on the sleeves and had her soft black hair tied into 2 uneven pigtails. Her fingers clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit, its ear chewed from anxiety. Its fur dull from being loved too hard. She did not cry. She did not look around. Her eyes were blank and locked on the floor. She hadn't said a single word since she was removed from her home 6 months earlier. No one could quite figure her out. Doctors had called it selective mutism, a trauma response, seen in children exposed to abuse. But no matter how many therapy sessions she sat through, Lila remained completely mute, trapped behind invisible walls no one could scale. And because of that silence, everything about this case felt like trying to read a book with the pages glued shut. The judge, a stern woman in her early 60s named Judge Halbrook, adjusted her glasses and looked over the reports. She didn't need to read them again. She knew the facts by heart now. The mother had denied the allegations, the father had been evasive, and Lila, sweet, scared, silent Lila, was the only one who knew the truth, but she wouldn't, or couldn't, speak. Lila's caseworker Miriam sat close beside her, watching protectively. Miriam had been working in child services for over a decade, and even she admitted she'd never felt a case this personal. "There's something in her eyes," she told the foster mother once. "She remembers everything. She just hasn't found the words to say it." Across the courtroom, the defense team whispered urgently among themselves, gesturing toward Lila with quiet annoyance. Their client, the biological father, sat still, arms crossed, a forced look of concern on his face. But Miriam had seen that look before many times, too many times. The prosecutor stood and cleared his throat, but before he could speak, the door creaked open at the back of the room. Heads turned. A uniformed officer walked in quietly, holding a leash. On the other end of it, padded a large, golden-furred dog. Calm, majestic, and gentle-eyed, the dog walked directly to where Lila sat and lowered himself beside her without hesitation. His name was Hero. Judge Halbrook leaned forward. "This is the canine therapy dog you mentioned, Ms. Rivera?" she asked Miriam. Miriam nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We were granted permission last week. Hero has worked with traumatized children before. I thought maybe he might help her feel safe, just enough to speak." The judge hesitated. Therapy animals weren't common in her courtroom, but this wasn't a common case. "Proceed," she said simply. As Hero settled onto the floor, something subtle happened. Lila's posture shifted. Her grip on the stuffed rabbit loosened. She turned her head slowly, deliberately toward the dog. Their eyes met. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't gasp or cry out or leap into his arms, but she moved closer, inched her body along the bench until she was close enough to touch him. Her tiny hand reached out and landed softly on his back. The whole room went still. Even the defense stopped whispering. Lila's eyes didn't leave Hero's. Her fingers began to stroke the fur behind his ears, over and over. The stuffed rabbit dropped to the floor. She didn't notice. Tears welled in Miriam's eyes. "It's the first time she's made contact with anything other than that toy," she whispered. Judge Halbrook scribbled something into her notes, but kept glancing at the child. The room held its collective breath. For the first time since the case began, there was movement in the silence, and somehow everyone knew something had just changed. No one dared speak for several seconds after Lila touched Hero. It wasn't just the quiet. It was reverence, the kind of stillness that settles over a room when people realize they're witnessing something fragile, something sacred. Her hand, so small against the golden fur, trembled just a little. But she didn't pull away. Hero didn't move either. His breathing was slow and even. His eyes stayed on Lila's, and though no one could explain it, the two of them seemed to speak a language no one else in that courtroom understood. Judge Halbrook leaned back in her chair, her normally composed face drawn into something softer. She wasn't sentimental by nature. Years on the bench had hardened that part of her, but even she couldn't ignore what was unfolding. The courtroom resumed, at least procedurally. The prosecutor began his statement, rehashing months of evidence: the CPS reports, the emergency room visit that raised initial red flags, the therapist's notes that hinted at trauma, but all of it circumstantial. He ended his opening with a single line that hung in the air like fog: "This case hinges on a voice that has not yet spoken." Meanwhile, Hero remained next to Lila, whose hand still brushed rhythmically across his coat. She hadn't uttered a word, but the weight in the room had shifted. Everyone could feel it. Miriam leaned down and whispered, "Would you like to draw today, sweetheart?" Lila didn't answer, but she didn't shake her head either, which in itself was something. A social worker quietly slid a coloring pad and crayons across the bench. Lila reached for a red crayon and began to scribble. She drew in circles, fast and uneven but focused. Hero's paw stayed close to her foot. She seemed to draw better that way, anchored by him. Across the aisle, the defense attorney, Mr. Callahan, a tall man with a silver tie and sharper tongue, watched with thinly veiled irritation. "This dog," he said in a low voice to his assistant, "is a distraction. It's going to influence the court emotionally, not legally." His assistant, younger and less sure, replied, "Maybe, but that girl hasn't moved or responded to anything until now." Callahan scoffed. "Therapy dog or not, if there's no testimony, we walk away clean. They know it. That's why they brought in the mutt." But he was wrong. Hero wasn't just a comfort tool. He was a bridge. By midday, the courtroom had transitioned into witness testimony. The foster mother took the stand, her voice cracking as she recounted the night Lila had woken up screaming words no one had taught her. Words that didn't belong in a 3-year-old's mouth. She wouldn't let any man near her for days, the foster mother said. Not even my husband, who she used to love being around. She would crawl under the table and scream if he walked in the room, the defense objected. Speculative, unreliable testimony. Sustained, the judge said, but not harshly. Back. At the bench, Lila was now leaning gently against Hero, her body slumped against his shoulder. She had stopped coloring, but her expression had changed. The emptiness was fading, replaced by something else. Miriam noticed it first. Her lips were moving, not speaking, just moving. "Is she trying to talk?" the handler whispered, glancing toward her. "Maybe," Miriam said softly. "Or maybe she's mouthing something." A strange hope fluttered through the courtroom like wind under a closed door. Could today be the day? The judge called for a short recess. People rose from their seats, stretched their backs and murmured about what they were witnessing, but no one left the room. Not really. Everyone stayed close, keeping Lila in the corner of their eyes. During the break, Miriam knelt beside her. "Dosihai, you like Hero?" she asked gently. Lila didn't speak, but for the first time she nodded. It was the smallest of gestures. But to those who'd been praying for a sign, it was everything. Hero, as if on cue, looked up and gave a single, quiet wag of his tail. Somehow everyone in that room knew. They had just seen the crack in the dam, and something big was coming next. The following morning, the courtroom was even more crowded. Word had spread about the girl, the dog, and the silence that might be breaking. Reporters tried to peek through the tall windows. A local blog had already dubbed the case "The Girl." "Hand the golden witness." But Lila didn't know any of that. She arrived quietly in the arms of her foster mother, her fingers already stretching out to feel Hero's fur before she even sat down. It was as if they had developed a silent ritual. She didn't smile, but her eyes no longer looked empty. Judge Halbrook entered with more solemnity than usual. She took her seat, adjusted her robe, and paused for a breath before motioning to the E. "Prosecutor." "Proceed," she said. "Today's testimony came from Dr. Chelsea Adams, a child psychologist assigned to observe Lila's development since the case began." Dr. Adams was careful with her words. She knew a child's future hung in the balance, and every sentence mattered. In the beginning, Dr. Adams said, "Lila, showed classic signs of trauma-induced mutism. No verbal expression, aversion to physical touch, and near-total emotional withdrawal. Most of her communication came through drawing, often chaotic and dark in color, consistent with children processing fear. "And has there been any change?" the judge asked. "Yes. Since the introduction of the therapy dog, Hero, we've observed a marked shift. She's showing curiosity. Her motor behavior is more confident. Her drawings now include faces, even if they're abstract. And yesterday, well..." Dr. Adams looked over at Lila, who was now lying on her side beside Hero, gently patting his head like she was rocking him to sleep. She nodded to a direct question. Dr. Adams continued. "That might sound small, but for a child locked in her own silence, it's monumental." The defense pounced immediately. "Doctor, would you say a dog's presence might cause a child to behave differently, even fabricate things, say to please adults or mimic behaviors?" Dr. Adams kept her composure. "No, Hero doesn't ask questions. He doesn't demand answers. He's a source of emotional safety. Children don't lie to dogs. That's why he's effective." The room held steady. The judge scribbled notes but kept her eyes on Lila. Then came the drawings. Miriam handed over a thick folder filled with Lila's recent pictures, crayon on sketch paper. Most had been done in the days since Hero arrived. One stood out starkly. It was a red and black mess of scribbles, jagged lines shooting toward a smaller figure in the corner, curled up and faceless. "She draws that one often," Miriam said softly. "Same colors, same pattern." There was silence. Even the defense team didn't interrupt this time. Another drawing was presented. This one was new. It showed a yellow figure, small but centered, next to a round shape with brown eyes and a wagging tail. Hero. Lila had drawn herself next to Hero, two figures, standing tall. She never drew herself upright before, Dr. Adams noted. Only curled, hidden. This is a shift in self-perception. She sees herself as safer, stronger. For the first time Lila looked up, her eyes met the judge's, not fearful, not confused, just watching. Judge Halbrook cleared her throat. "Does the child understand why she's here?" Miriam nodded gently. "We've explained in age-appropriate ways. She knows this is a place where people listen. We told her the truth matters here." The defense looked uneasy. The power was slipping. Then something unexpected happened. As Dr. Adams stepped down from the stand, Lila reached into her lap and picked up the crayon she had dropped earlier. She began to draw again, this time slowly, with focus. Hero shifted. His weight but didn't move from her side. The judge leaned slightly forward, watching the girl with something that resembled hope flickering behind her stern eyes. No words had been spoken aloud. But across the courtroom the feeling was unanimous. Lila was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to speak, in her own way, in her own time, and they were finally beginning to listen. Court resumed after the lunch recess, but the mood in the room had shifted. There was a collective sense of waiting, tense and quiet like the pause before a thunderstorm. Lila had remained in the courtroom during the break, curled beside Hero, her fingers tangled in his thick golden coat. She hadn't spoken yet, but everyone felt it. The silence was thinning. Judge Halbrook called the room to order with her gavel. "Let's continue." The next witness was Officer Dana Brooks, the responding officer from the night the initial complaint was made. She wore her uniform with quiet confidence, but her eyes softened as she took the stand. "I was dispatched." "To the residence around 9:30 p.m., she said, her voice even. Her neighbor had reported loud yelling and a child screaming. When I arrived, I found the child, Lila, alone in a locked bedroom. There was a murmur from the gallery. She was crouched in the corner," Officer Brooks continued, her throat tightening just slightly. "She wouldn't look at me, wouldn't let me come near her. But when I crouched down and let her see my badge, I remember she pointed to it, then to the door." "She wanted out?" the prosecutor asked. "She wanted help," Brooks answered, her voice breaking for the briefest moment. Even if she couldn't say the words. Miriam watched Lila closely. The girl was still drawing, lines and circles on her paper, Hero's head now resting in her lap. But something was different. Her posture was straighter. She looked less like a ghost and more like a girl. And then it happened. It started so quietly, Miriam almost didn't catch it. A whisper, a breath, 2 words, spoken so softly they barely crossed the distance between her and the dog. But Hero's ears perked up instantly, and his tail gave a slow, sweeping wag across the floor. Lila said, "Good boy." Miriam froze. So did the courtroom. Hero sat up slowly, his tongue rolling out in a happy pant. It wasn't dramatic, no music swelled, but for those who'd been waiting months, it was the sound of a dam cracking. Judge Halbrook leaned forward. "Did she just—" "She spoke," Miriam whispered, eyes filling with tears. "She spoke." The court stenographer looked up from her keyboard, stunned. The words weren't much, but they were hers. The prosecutor glanced at the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess and a closed-room session with the child, if she's willing." Halbrook nodded slowly. "Granted. Clear the room. Everyone except the appointed parties." Within minutes, the benches were emptied. Reporters, spectators, even the defense team were ushered out. Only the judge, prosecutor, defense attorney, Dr. Adams, Miriam, and Officer Brooks remained. And Hero, of course, who sat loyally beside Lila, like a knight watching over his queen. Miriam crouched beside her and gently said, "Lila, would you like to tell us anything?" Lila's hand gripped Hero's fur tightly. Then, slowly, she nodded. Her lips trembled. Her voice was as fragile as glass. She pointed to one of her drawings, one with a large black scribble over a small figure. "That's Daddy," she said. Every adult in the room went completely still. She looked at another drawing, the one with herself and Hero. "That's me." "And Hero, he saved me." Miriam's hand came to her mouth. The judge didn't speak. She didn't have to. She already knew. Lila had finally found her voice, and in just 2 words, "Good boy." She had opened the door to truth. The courtroom, once a space of tension and silence, had become a place of quiet courage, and a little girl who had once hidden behind a stuffed rabbit had stepped forward, holding nothing but a crayon and the love of a golden dog. Lila's 2 whispered words reverberated far beyond the 4 walls of that courtroom. By the next morning, the closed session had become the subject of quiet murmurs among courthouse staff. No one had official access to the transcript. Judge Halbrook had ordered it sealed, but the news had already traveled by whisper, by instinct, by awe. She spoke. It became a phrase that carried weight, not because of its length, but because of who had spoken and what it meant. Behind the scenes, things moved quickly. With Lila's words came the green light to reopen specific parts of the investigation. Her father, now visibly unnerved, was called back in for an additional interview. The defense had stopped smirking. Their client's carefully rehearsed narrative was unraveling, and they knew it. But while the legal gears turned in the background, something more remarkable was happening in the foreground. Lila was healing. It didn't happen all at once. Her silence didn't lift like a curtain, but it came in pieces, quiet, delicate phrases often spoken only to Hero. "Sit. Stay. I missed you." Words that had once been locked behind trauma were now making their way into daylight. Dr. Adams scheduled a private play-based interview to explore how much Lila remembered and how much she could communicate safely. Lila, with Hero beside her, pointed to drawings and used her small, cracking voice to tell short, fragmented stories. "She's identifying key moments," Dr. Adams later explained to the judge. "Her mind is beginning to file the trauma into language. That's a profound step toward recovery." The drawings changed too. The jagged black figures shrank. The colors grew lighter. Hero began appearing in almost every picture, a guardian, a shield, sometimes even with wings. In Lila's world, Hero wasn't just a dog, he was safety. Still, not everyone welcomed the change. The defense team moved to dismiss the new evidence as emotionally biased. "This is hearsay through crayon and dog tricks," Callahan argued. "How you cannot rebuild a case based on a child's scribbles and one whispered phrase." But Judge Halbrook had grown quiet and cold. She tapped her pen against the bench once, then twice. "Mr. Callahan," she said flatly, "you may underestimate the power of a child's voice. I do not." He tried to object further, but the room had turned against him, not with shouting, not with anger, just stillness. A courtroom full of people no longer interested in rehearsed excuses. Meanwhile, Hero was becoming something of a courthouse celebrity. Other children, victims of domestic disputes or custody battles, asked for the golden dog from Lila's trial. He brought calm to chaos. His very presence reminded them of Lila's courage. Miriam noticed it too. Every time Hero entered the building, Lila would sit up a little straighter, her hands less shaky, her mouth a little closer to speech. She trusts him like no one else, Miriam told the prosecutor one morning. He doesn't push, he doesn't question. He's just there, that's what she needed. But even with all the progress, the team knew the hardest part was still coming. Lila would have to testify, not in the traditional sense. No one wanted to put her on the witness stand under pressure. But in a closed, child-safe interview recorded for the court, she would be asked to recall what happened. With Hero at her side, she would face the memory head-on. Dr. Adams prepared her gently, over days, and on the final day of prep, as the session ended, Lila turned to Hero, hugged him tightly and whispered something no one had taught her. "I'm brave now." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But in that moment, everyone in the room, Miriam, Dr. Adams, even the court-appointed guardian, felt the weight of those 3 little words. Lila wasn't just recovering. She was preparing to fight back, with crayons, courage, and the only witness who never needed to speak. The morning of Lila's testimony arrived with a kind of stillness that didn't feel like peace. It felt like the breath you take before jumping into deep water. The courtroom remained closed for the session. Only essential parties were present: Judge Halbrook, the attorneys, Dr. Adams, Miriam, the child advocate, and a court technician who would manage the playback of the recorded interview. Lila wasn't physically there, but the screen was, set up in the center of the courtroom like a quiet stage waiting for the smallest star to shine. The lights dimmed. The technician pressed play. The screen flickered, and there she was. Lila, wearing a soft yellow sweater, hair in 2 uneven ponytails, sitting cross-legged on a blue rug. Hero lay beside her, his head on his paws. He didn't move, didn't blink, except when she reached over to gently stroke his back. Dr. Adams's voice was off camera. "Lila, do you remember why we're here today?" Lila nodded. Dr. Adams waited. "A moment. Can you tell me who Hero is?" Lila smiled slightly. "He's my best boy." The courtroom watched, transfixed. The girl who had once frozen at the sight of strangers now sat calmly beside her dog, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, but clear, like glass. Then came the moment no one wanted to rush. "Do you remember the room with the locked door?" Dr. Adams asked. Lila's hand paused over Hero's back, her eyes lowered. For a long moment she said nothing. Miriam gripped the edge of the bench, her heart thudding. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Lila nodded. "Can you tell me what happened?" Lila didn't look up, but she spoke, slowly, carefully. "Daddy was mad, really mad. He hurt my arm." Her left hand curled involuntarily around. Her right elbow, the same elbow that had been fractured that night. He said I had to be quiet, or he'd make Hero go away. Dr. Adams didn't correct her, didn't remind her that Hero hadn't even entered her life yet. Trauma doesn't work in timelines, and sometimes healing rewrites memory with hope. He said not to tell anyone, Lila added, voice faltering, not even Mama. She wiped her nose on her sleeve and Hero nudged closer. But Hero said I could be safe. The courtroom shifted. The prosecutor made a quick note. Callahan, the defense attorney, remained unnervingly still. Then came the most powerful moment of all. Dr. Adams asked gently, "Why did you decide to tell now?" Lila leaned forward and hugged Hero around his neck. "Because Hero said I'm brave," she whispered. "And when you're brave, you can say the truth out loud." The screen froze on that image, Lila hugging Hero, face buried in his fur, courage captured in one still frame. The judge sat back, blinking slowly. Her gavel remained untouched. Words weren't needed yet. The courtroom remained in stunned silence for nearly 30 seconds. Then Miriam spoke, voice cracking. That was the most she's spoken about it. Ever. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, with this video and her previous statements, we believe the child's testimony is clear, consistent, and, most importantly, voluntarily given. We move to formally admit this recording into evidence. Callahan rose slowly. Your Honor, the defense maintains that the child is under psychological suggestion. Therapy dogs, emotional reinforcement, these are not stable conditions for gathering legal testimony. Judge Halbrook turned to him with a gaze like steel. She's 3 years old, Mr. Callahan. She wasn't coached. She was rescued. He opened his mouth to protest, but then sat down. There was nothing left to say. The judge's eyes moved to the paused screen again. Lila had spoken, and now the court would listen. In the weeks leading up to the trial's conclusion, that video would become the heart of the case. More powerful than any report, louder than any accusation. It didn't shout. It didn't dramatize. It simply told the truth, and sometimes that's all justice needs. The day after Lila's testimony was played in court, the courthouse no longer felt like just a building. It felt like a living, breathing witness, a silent observer to everything that had happened and everything that was still about to unfold. The impact of the video was undeniable. In the hallways, clerks whispered about the girl with the golden dog. Lawyers who had never once glanced up from their briefcases now paused at the sight of Hero. Even court security gave him quiet nods, of respect as he padded through the building beside Miriam and Lila. But Lila didn't notice the stares. She was still drawing, still whispering to Hero, still healing in quiet moments between the cracks of chaos. And in the courtroom, the legal machine rumbled toward its final motion. The prosecution rested. The final evidence had been submitted. The medical reports confirming healed fractures and bruises, the testimony from Officer Brooks, the psychologist's evaluations, and, above all, Lila's own words. The defense, however, made one last push. Callahan stood before the judge, no longer arrogant but desperate. Your Honor, he began, voice unusually low, we acknowledge the emotional power of this case, but I ask you, implore you, not to confuse emotion with fact. We are speaking of a 3-year-old child, a toddler. Her statements are inconsistent. They're subjective. What we're really watching is the work of suggestion. A well-meaning therapist, a clever therapy dog, and an environment that promotes compliance. He paused, scanning the nearly empty room. This court must remember, sentiment is not justice. Judge Halbrook didn't interrupt, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. The prosecutor, poised and unflinching, stepped forward as soon as Callahan sat down. There is nothing sentimental about a child begging silently to be heard, she said. There's nothing emotional about medical records confirming physical abuse, and there is absolutely nothing subjective about truth, spoken plainly by a child who had everything to lose by speaking it. She let that sit. Lila didn't speak to get attention. She spoke to be free. With both sides concluded, the courtroom quieted. The judge would retire to her chambers to deliberate, but before she left the bench, she looked at Hero, seated, once again beside Lila, who had been permitted to stay for this part. He was calm, still, watching the judge the way only dogs can, without challenge, without fear. You did well, Judge Halbrook said quietly. No one knew if she meant the lawyers, the child, or the dog. Maybe all three. That night the courthouse emptied, but no one truly slept. Miriam sat awake on her couch, scrolling through her notes, even though the work was done. She had never felt more uncertain or more hopeful. Dr. Adams was in her office, late reviewing Lila's progress, every video, every session, every breakthrough. And in the small guest bedroom where Lila now slept temporarily under state protection, she stirred in her bed and reached out a hand to touch Hero, who was lying nearby. Her hand rested lightly on his back, like she needed to feel something solid, something alive. I was brave today, she whispered. Hero's tail thumped once. In her sleep, she smiled. The next morning, the verdict was set to be delivered. The gallery filled. The air was thick with tension. Lila was not present. Miriam had wisely kept her away, but her presence was still felt in every corner of the room. Judge Halbrook took her seat. No papers shuffled. No motions were made. She cleared her throat. In the case of Lila Carter, the court finds the allegations of abuse to be credible, substantiated by testimony, medical evidence, and the child's own statements given in a protected setting. Full custody is awarded to the state pending permanent placement. Criminal charges against the father are to proceed. A heavy pause. This court does not take lightly the voice of a child, especially one who had to fight so hard to find it. Gavel. Strike done. It had been 3 months since the gavel fell. The courtroom was now just a building in the background, silent, distant, almost forgotten in the face of something far more important. Lila's life was hers again. No more locked rooms. No more heavy footsteps in the hallway. No more fear whispering through the walls at night. Instead, there was light. It began simply. A foster home, carefully selected by the court with Miriam's input. A small house with a yellow door and wind. Chimes that sang on breezy afternoons. The woman who lived there, Ms. Penny, had soft eyes and a soft voice and let Lila pick her own cereal the first morning, and best of all, Hero came too. Officially, he was still a therapy dog. Unofficially, he was Lila's shadow, her guardian, and perhaps the first soul to ever teach her that love didn't come with conditions. He followed her through every room of the house, napped beside her during her new favorite cartoons, and waited patiently outside the bathroom door when she bathed. Sometimes at night, Lila would wake from a dream with tears in her eyes, but this time, she didn't cry silently. She would call out, "Hero?" and hear the soft tap of his paws on the hallway floor, and then she would sleep again. Dr. Adams continued weekly sessions, now held on the back porch with lemonade and crayons. Lila was speaking more and more. Not always full sentences, but full enough to carry meaning. I like this house. I like Penny. Hero had a dream. He was flying. Each sentence was a thread, and together they wove something whole. A voice no longer lost. One day, while drawing, Lila surprised everyone by asking a question. "Will I have a forever, Mama?" Penny had been watering plants nearby. She knelt, down brushing dirt off her hands, and said softly, "I hope so, sweetheart. Maybe even me if that's what you want." Lila nodded once. Okay, just like that, no fanfare, no long speeches, but the look in Penny's eyes said everything. The process would take time. Papers, home studies, more court hearings. But for the first time in a very long time, Lila wanted to stay. Miriam still visited once a week. She brought new chew toys for Hero and fresh packs of colored pencils for Lila. But what touched her most was how little Lila clung to her now. Not out of distance, but out of growth. "You're getting big," Miriam said during one visit. "I know," Lila said proudly. "Hero says I'm strong now." Miriam smiled. "He's right. You're the strongest little girl I know." Before leaving, Lila handed her a drawing. It was a house with a yellow door, a stick figure with pigtails, and beside her Hero, with what appeared to be wings. "That's me," she said, pointing. "And that's Hero flying. He keeps me safe, even up high." Miriam blinked quickly to keep her tears in check. "It's beautiful." That night, Penny tucked Lila into bed, the soft glow of a nightlight casting stars across her ceiling. Hero curled at the foot of the bed. Penny sat on the edge of the mattress. "Anything you want to tell me before sleep," Lila thought, then said, "Sometimes I remember the bad stuff." "That's okay," Penny whispered. "It might always come and go, but it won't control you anymore." Lila looked at her, serious. "Because I talked?" "Yes," Penny said. "Because you talked and because you're brave." Lila looked down at Hero, then back up. "I wasn't brave alone." And with that, she turned on her side, tiny fingers resting on Hero's paw. Her breathing slowed. The world for now was quiet. Outside, the wind stirred the chimes again and the stars blinked like promises. And in that moment, one thing was clear. The girl who once couldn't speak had taught the world how to listen.